All right, and I'm just going to share my screen so everybody can see examples of the forms and some explanations and things like that. When we're all set, we will go ahead and stop and have questions. If anybody has questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can just join in at that time when I ask for those. So today we're going to talk about post-award responsibilities and basically just differentiating once you receive an award, what are the department and PI's duties versus what are grants and contracts duties. And it kind of breaks it down by the unit so that you can see which side does which part. This is just our post-award team, in case you're not familiar with all of us. This is our full team at the moment. And the post-award responsibilities chart is on our website. I did put a link to that if anybody wants to take a look at that later. And it just kind of a little blurb showing you what that looks like. Again, just to differentiate which side of us does which tasks to make the workflow a little bit smoother. So I'm going to start with the ProCard applications and purchasing. On the department and PI side, you're going to confirm that your purchases they're within your grant budget category. They're allowed by your program. You would allocate those purchases in the work system and add a little bit of details so that when we review that, we can see what the business purpose was. There's a monthly statement report that's got 2 signatures on it, the cardholder and the cardholder supervisor. And that with the receipts gets emailed to our grant services email. That is monthly that we do that by the 20th of each month. And after 35 business days, you could have your card suspended if we don't have that. And that's just because we need that documentation to review and be able to bill, particularly for federal agencies. On the grants and contracts side, we review those applications as they come in. We also collect that documentation, your statement and the receipts, and we kind of review that to make sure that it was allowable and in the budget before we bill those federal agencies and the non-federal as well. This is just an example of what that application looks like in case you have not had to do one of those yet. You can kind of take a look at that. Your default fund and department is your grant account, but the alternate fund and department would be your wrap account or some other non-grant account in case that charge was not allowable on the grant. We also have the pre-award and backstop form. If you know that an award is coming and you would like to start spending or appointing students or other faculty on there, it's best to do the pre-award account request. And we just call that a backstop. Basically, that gives another account that we can charge to if expenses are not allowed, but it also allows us to set up that grant account ahead of time so that you don't have to later on move expenses to the grant. You can just put them right on there. So the department and the PI complete that form and get the signatures on it and then send it over to grant services. We get the rest of the signatures on that and set up the account, and then we get back to you to let you know what your account number is so that you can start the spending or the appointments. So the best thing about this is there's no journal entries to complete if you've already allocated everything to that grant account ahead of time. It also allows you to be able to do student appointments, any appointments, so that you don't have to double the paperwork, have a student appointed on a non-grant fund, and then later move them to a grant fund. It just makes everything a little bit cleaner and also prevents that cost transfer that we'll talk about in a little bit here. This is an example of what the form looks like. And just noting that your departmental fund and cost center is that non-grant account that we would use if for some reason the grant didn't come through or this was not allowable on that project. The rationale is just helpful to have a short explanation of why you're requesting the pre-award spending. And also if you have any documentation from the sponsor where they're noting that they're going to be awarding that, or maybe we're just waiting on the signatures on a contract, that helps us to know that you do have the funding, fairly likely to come through. And that just saves the burden on the university for having to bear those expenses if for some reason that grant did not come through. For personnel, we have planned effort, summer salary, and grad appointments. The planned effort form, the department and PI will fill that out to determine who is key personnel. You want to make sure that you're not putting down less than 25% of what you proposed would be your effort, because that requires approval from the sponsor if there's that big of a change. You'd email that form to the grant services email. You may have to do a JES if the form submitted with pay periods already processed. So if your planned effort started, for September for fall and we don't get that form until October, then you would, as a department, would have to do those journal entries to allocate the pay for those payrolls that have already been processed. We review that against the budget, make sure that the release time corresponds. And then we enter that into the PeopleSoft HR system so that those payroll amounts automatically get distributed each payroll. And we would also let you know if there are journal entries to be completed. For the faculty summer appointments, it's additional appointments for most people that summer unless you have an alternate academic year. So you would provide every part of your workload that you're going to be doing for the summer, and it's broken down by summer 1 and summer 2. And we just need to know any teaching assignments, other grants you may be working on, because you are limited to a certain percent of effort to be able to get paid for that summer appointment. Typically, that's 95% of your time, and that just allows for any time off you may take, any other administrative duties or other things that you may have to work on. You can get approved for 100%, but that is contingent on a dean letter saying why you would need 100%, and then approval from ORI, just to document that you're aware you're not taking any time off, no vacation, no sick time, nothing, if you're allocating 100%. For the graduate assistant appointments, the department and the PI are going to confirm that there's still enough funds in the account before you submit the forms. Make sure that you apply for the grant tuition fund code through Banner, which goes through the grad college. There's a letter and signatures that you need to send to the grad college to get approval for that appointment. And then the department would enter the appointment in Banner and the PeopleSoft workflow so that we have both the stipend side and the tuition side in there. Grants and contracts goes in, reviews those forms to make sure that they're in the budget, they're within the grant dates, and that it's allowable on the grant. So this is just an example of the planned effort form, so you can see kind of what it looks like. There's the 2 different lines where if you're allocating release or buyout, you would put your dollar amount on that line. If it's cost share, we want that to go in that cost share field, and that just helps us differentiate which way we're recording that and how it's being allocated. For technology purchases, the department and the PI, you do need to have grants and contracts approval, and it cannot be made with a pro card. So anything over $5,000 has to be reviewed by purchasing. I did put a link to that tech approval so that you can see what that process is, all the details that goes through the OIT side. And then once all that part is complete, it comes to grants and contracts. We review that work order, again, checking that it's in the budget, checking that it's allowable on the grant, making sure that we have that purchase order authorization as well from purchasing if it's over 5,000. For budgets or budget revisions, ultimately the PI is responsible for the budget management. making sure things that are allowable, that they're in the budget, that they're allocated properly. It's best to review monthly so that if you do see some kind of an issue, we can catch it sooner rather than later. It's a little bit easier to fix it that way, or to do a revision if we need to. And grants and contracts reviews any of those budget exceptions against what the sponsor has given us for regulations in that award document. If you do need to do a budget revision, the general rule in our area is if it's 10% of the total budget or more that you're changing your budget categories, that we typically have you do the university prior approval form and also a budget revision form. And that just shows us where you're moving your budget so we can make sure we're not adding or subtracting total dollars, and where you want that allocated. In some cases, we do have to get the sponsor approval for that, but a lot of those agencies allow us to waive that if it's under a certain amount. Program allowability is a responsibility of the PI. We do check that over, kind of take a look and make sure when you're doing your budget revision that it looks like it's within the confines of the grant, but that is ultimately the PI responsibility. There's a couple important things to remember about budgeting. As I mentioned, changes over 10% of the total budget require that prior approval and budget revision form, possibly written approval from the funder, depending on who that is. You can't change participant support allocations without prior approval from the sponsor. They will not allow you to take away from or add to participant support without approval. If your award is total direct costs, then facilities and administration, that we call F&A, is applied to all the costs. But if you have modified TDC, which is fairly common, that's most of what we have, F&A is not charged to tuition, scholarships, fellowships, subawards over 25K, capital equipment, rental of space, patient care charges, or participant support, but it is charged to the other budget categories. Our policy at WMU is that the full F&A costs be recovered on every proposal as to the extent allowable by the sponsor. You'll see some agencies that will not pay the full F&A, which is currently 51% here. They may pay 8%, they may pay 11%, I believe MDHHS usually pays 10%. It just depends on the agency, what they allow. Cost transfer requests may be needed if you are outside of the period. So you spent this money in October, in November, you decide you need to move where that was charged to. That would require a cost transfer unless it's payroll, and then we require the cost transfer if the ESERT period has already been confirmed. And we'll discuss ESERT in a minute here too. So the department and the PI fill out that cost transfer request form. If it's beyond 90 days, there's extra questions on there. So it's questions 1 through 6, depending on the time period that you're requesting. And then grants and contracts reviews that, again, checks the budget, checks the allowability, the grant dates. And then we get approval from our director to see if that cost transfer is approved. This is what the cost transfer request form looks like. You can see on there that there's questions 1 through 6, and the directions do tell you in which cases you need to do all the questions, in which cases you can just do the first, I believe it's 3. So you have to have your documentation. Any expenses that you're trying to move to a grant, we just ask that you send that documentation with the cost transfer request. The expense has to be in the approved budget. And like I mentioned, if the expense is beyond 90 days, you would answer those questions 4 through 6, which are for extenuating circumstances. Some grants have subawards involved in them. So there's subaward invoices, and then I've also included journal entry transactions on this slide. So the subaward invoice, Those invoices come to grants and contracts first. We send out a PI review form to the PI, and that's just, it got some requirements on there that you look over to make sure you're approving those expenses on that subaward. That comes back to us. The department completes a generic voucher to go with paying that invoice. That comes back to us for final approval. And then once we approve that, we send that on to accounts payable. For journal entries, the department generally enters those with the, the PI's approval that you're moving that expense. We need the journal entry documentation to show what the expense was so that we know it's applicable to the grant. And then we review that documentation and if necessary, the cost transfer form. The billing process for the subawards, like I mentioned, the invoice goes to the PI who reviews that. The department fills out the generic voucher and then that comes back to us. And this just kind of reiterates that you would use account code 4825 for the first 25,000 of expenses on a subaward and 4816 for anything over that 25. And that's just because of that modified total direct cost, whether or not there's being F&A charged on there. For journal entries, you just want to remember that you're moving the expense, you're not moving money. So if you charged your department account, you're going to move that expense off the department account and onto the grant. You are not moving money off the grant and to recover that department account or vice versa. So it just kind of reiterates that cost transfer request when you would need that, that I discussed a few minutes ago. You don't need a cost transfer if you're removing an expense from a grant, only if you're adding it to the grant. eCert is our payroll certification system that's federally required. So the department and the PI will have a department coordinator who pre-reviews the charges. You just taking the initial look to make sure these are the people that should be paid on this grant for this period. These amounts look correct. I don't see anybody missing or anybody extra. And then that rolls over to the PI to confirm and certify that those are the correct people, those are the correct amounts. Responsibility ultimately lies with the PI on that your department coordinator is just doing your initial review. Grants and Contracts sends out reminders because we do eCert 3 times a year. So we send out those reminders that the pre-review period is opening, the confirmation period is opening, so that you're aware of that. It is a federally required to have a payroll confirmation system. We break ours into 3 periods, basically by semester. We do combine summer 1 and summer 2 in there. It's just a little easier than trying to make you confirm 4 times a year. So we do summer, fall, and spring. And there's 2 weeks access to be able to complete pre-review. And then the PIs have 3 weeks to confirm after that. If you see an issue, somebody's missing, somebody extra is in there, somebody's payroll is not the correct amount, it should not be pre-reviewed or confirmed until we've had a chance to fix that. And you can work with, between the department and Grants and Contracts, we will help you to fix that. For vendor contracts or independent contracts, the department and the PI do the initial working with purchasing, business services, whether you need a statement of work, a sole source justification, any information you need from the vendor or that contractor. The initial piece all starts with the PI and the department. And then once that part is complete, Grants and Contracts reviews that against the budget and the grant dates. We would sign off on that if it's allowable and send that back to purchasing or business services for final approval. That goes with both the vendor contract and the independent contract. The independent contract has a few additional forms if it's a federal grant or an NSF grant. And this is just an example of what those forms look like. So, you'd have your general voucher when you're paying them, you attach the independent contract to that so that AP can see it's all approved. And then whether or not you need Exhibit B and C, depending on if it's a federal grant or an NSF grant as well. For temporary staff or student employees, the department will always follow WMU HR procedures for hiring. Grants and contracts follows all WMU policies and procedures, as well as what's stipulated in the award document. So you would go ahead and follow those procedures, enter the initial appointment in the PeopleSoft HR workflow. The department's responsible for collecting timesheets, reviewing, entering hours into Kronos, the PI for approving that time, and then grants and contracts reviews against the budget and for that it's within the grant dates. For student employees, the department is still responsible for collecting timesheets and reviewing them. They would facilitate the hiring process, educate the student on what they need to do for timekeeping. And then again, grants and contracts just reviews that PSHR workflow form before we can approve that, and it moves on through the process. For sponsor required reports and grant closure, the department and the PI are going to review that award document to see what all the reporting requirements are. We do generally send out reminders as a courtesy when you have a technical report or a financial report or a termination of a grant coming up. And we send that out to the PI so that you're aware of that. Generally, the department and the PI are going to have all that documentation available for your financial records. You're tracking that, making sure everything's allowable, allocable. We do have to submit reports on time. If we are late, particularly on federal grants, that can jeopardize getting grants in the future. They can stop funding until they get that report. There's just repercussions. So we always try to get those in on time. Grants and contracts always completes the financial part of the report. We do contact the PI to make sure that all the expenditures are accurate for that reporting period, but we do complete that part. When the grants are closing, we send out the grant termination letter 120 days before the grant ends. It gives you that time to see this is about what we have left to spend. Termination is coming up so that you can complete the project. You would want to review the project closeout procedure that I linked there to follow those requirements. And then grants and contracts works with the PI just to confirm all final expenses, submit all financial reports within those deadlines. For gift card purchasing, the department and the PI fill out that gift card authorization form. It needs to have a description and be routed for signature. There is also the gift card disbursement log that you're going to keep so that we know all those cards have been dispersed, to who they've been given, and there's different signature requirements, whether those people are being emailed, whether they're being handed the cards in person, or sometimes their names are not listed if it's research and it's confidential. We review that gift card authorization, again, checking the budget and the grant dates. We would approve that and send it back to the department. With the logs, we do go over those, make sure that everything reconciles, and the department would complete a journal entry to transfer money from the prepaid account, which is that $17.90, to the expense. And then we approve that journal entry. This is an example of the gift card authorization sheet. It's got on there that you're requesting the amount of gift cards that you're going to disperse within 60 days, that you have 90 days to get us the log to reconcile. And it's got all that information on there. You do have to have IRB approval for research studies. So that goes through ORI as well. And then we need that detailed log so that we know how everything was distributed. Gift cards are essentially equivalent to cash, so we make sure that everything is being distributed and tracked properly. For prize awards and scholarships, the department is going to provide us with all the student information, the description. If there's a competition, we need the description of that in that prize award form. And we would review that when we go get ready to invoice the sponsor for that expense. So the scholarships, same thing, the department completes all those forms, but those do come to grants and contracts first for our signature and approval, and then we send that on to financial aid. For reimbursement vouchers and travel, we follow the WMU travel policy. The department would process that repayment with the generic voucher, make sure the receipts, fund and cost center, justification are all on there, and we review that before we invoice the sponsor. As far as the travel goes, you're still going to follow those WMU travel policies, complete the travel authorization, submit all receipts for reimbursement. And then we go ahead and review if there's international travel. We approve that before the authorization goes through on travel within the United States. We don't do pre-approval. We just review that at the time of invoicing. So for travel, basically what we need, as I mentioned, is making sure your travel is already in the budget, particularly with international travel. It's not allowed if it's not in the approved budget. We need you to include all those fees, transportation, food, travel, parking, all those things that are going to be included in there. And we follow per diem for meals, complete the travel authorization, and submit that travel voucher for reimbursement after travel. We do also have on our webpage an FAQ list, and I've got the link to that here. Basically just answers a lot of the commonly asked questions about who do you ask about, like you would go through HR for personnel questions, and what's the PI responsible for at the university, what is FNA, and that is available on our website. There's a lot of helpful information there as well. We also have remote office locations at some of the colleges, so that if anybody has questions, we do take drop-ins. You can make appointments if you know you're going to want to be in. And each of us has time at the colleges that we service, but we're there at different days and times. So you would want to check with your RFA to see what time they're going to be at that location. This is a list of our upcoming trainings. You can see that next month for January, we're going to do allowability of costs. And that's just give you a little preview in case you want to sign up for a future, which I hope you do. But that tells you which ones are coming up and when. Does anybody have any questions? I answered most of those along the way, but I know sometimes things pop up. Anna, is there anything in the chat?
It's been so quiet.
Oh boy, that's because I talk too much.
No, it's totally good.
Nobody had time to ask questions in there. Well, if anybody does think of something after the fact, you can always call us, email us, and let us know, and we'll try to help you out with that, point you in the right direction. But I appreciate everybody coming. Hopefully you did learn some things. And then, as I said, we will be posting this recording and the PDF of the slides at a later time so that everybody can still access those if you know people that weren't able to attend and you have new hires you think it would be helpful. So that should be available.